Okay, I think we're going to get started. For those who haven't met me yet, I'm Dr. David Gold. I'm really excited to be here in the summer, and I'm really excited to have our guest today, Adrienne Siegel. So I think this is a little different from some of the talks we've been doing because Adrienne is a professional artist. She's got her training and has been teaching at the California College of the Arts. And I invited her here because I think the art's really cool and because she's really like a leader in something called data physicalization, right? So taking scientific data, particularly things related to history and ecology, and giving it material form. She even brought some of her stuff with us. So glad you're here, glad to see everyone online, and I will let you just get going.
Cool, I think that mic is working. Sweet, thanks for having me, thanks for coming. I'll just jump right into it. Any of you recognize this site? Yes, what's it called? Yeah, so what used to be there was a big bathhouse. At the time it was built, it was the largest bathhouse swimming facility, indoor recreational swimming facility in the country in 1896. And the water from the ocean was being harnessed. The tides would recirculate the water, basically for recreational, fun swimming. I visited that site during my undergraduate degree and got really interested in the tides, both the force of the tides being harnessed for these pools, but also how now they're ruins and just kind of slowly being taken back into the ocean. So when you start researching how tide patterns work, you can look up scientific data about that. And this is the tides for one full day at that particular site, basically San Francisco Bay, just in purely raw data form. So every 6 minutes, they take a measurement. When you start to map that out on a Cartesian coordinate system, the NOAA that manages the historic tide database creates a chart like this. So you can see in San Francisco, there are 2 highs and 2 lows per day. And it's different all over the world depending on what land masses are around. The more you learn about tides, you realize they're controlled by the force of the moon in relation to the sun on the earth. And so the tides are actually a monthly cycle that repeats. So this is a chart showing the full month of tides with neaps and floods, but also overlaid with where the moon is at in the cycle. So I took a full month of tide data, downloaded it from the NOAA archives for San Francisco Bay, and illustrated kind of this 2-dimensional graphic. I was getting an undergraduate degree in furniture design, and it's a program I teach in now. So my interest is in making 3-dimensional objects and working with materials. And so I was really exploring how I could make that information accessible in a different way. And mapping things in a 3-dimensional context, and like I mentioned, in physical materials. So this is some of my process of how I conceptualize and make work. On the far side is some sketching, kind of playing around with shape and proportion and how to take that information and make it into something that creates not just an interesting object, but something you can kind of intuitively understand. And then closer to me is flat bar steel, which I made kind of templates and bent each one by hand into the shape for each day chart. And then created sort of a wood framework to hold all of those pieces for the full cycle together. So this piece is about maybe 2.5 feet tall and 6 feet long, and it's sort of in the scope of being furniture functional, but not really. That's not the main purpose. But in a familiar scale that your body can walk around the piece and really understand it in a intuitive way. Most people know exactly what this is what information is contained in here if you're familiar with tide charts. So surfers, sailors know automatically what this is. Other people can read the title of the piece, which is tidal datum, and then they get the sense, oh, it's actually referring to something else. But it's otherwise not marked or labeled, or there's no measurements on there. And then here's the piece installed in the context of an art gallery. This was a show called Data Deluge in Marfa, Texas, with a bunch of other artists who also work within the realm of data in their creative practice. So that was my undergraduate degree, and then 15 years later, this is kind of the scale I've been working at with some projects now. This is a public art piece out in Alameda, not too far from the Oakland airport, actually, and it's very much inspired by the tides. Public art is a different form of an art practice that requires sort of similar conceptualization. You can see this piece is still inspired by tides. It's right on the ocean, so looking at what it means to be at that site when you're looking out of the ocean. How do you give people a physical representation of some invisible force in the landscape around them that they can interact with? So these are some of the documentation of what a public art proposal looks like. And then some of the fabrication of this piece, in which case, when you're getting into a larger scale public piece, usually there's engineering involved and materials or processes that require a more industrial or larger factory to help realize. So in these cases, I work in partnership with a fabrication facility, in this case, a company called Concrete Works that helped fabricate this piece and install it for me. And that went in 2022. So anybody can go visit this piece. It's out in Alameda on Bay Farm Island. So sculpture is an aesthetic language I use to bridge the gap between reason and emotion. And I just kind of want to break that down for you in terms of data sculpture, otherwise known as data physicalization, because this is not a brand new field, but it's kind of being contextualized and named in a new way. So a data sculpture is a physical artifact whose geometry or material properties are encoded with data. The principles are still based in how we visually encode in graphic form, such as this graphic shows you've got shape, size, value, texture, color, orientation, and then like the 2D position. What I think data physicalization brings in is just more variables for encoding with, which include form, material, and space. There are others, but that's kind of how I like to break it down. And there are a lot of other examples throughout history of different cultures that have physicalized data in different ways, including the Incan quipu, which was a system of tying knots into ropes to track data, and the Mesopotamian clay tokens, which were marked clay tabs used for commodity trade. If you're interested in learning more about the full archive that a few researchers in Europe have been putting together for the last 10 or so years, I want to plug dataphys.org. It's a really great resource for seeing both old and contemporary projects that all relate to physicalization of data in a lot of interesting ways. And then more recently, there are 2 new books that came out, Making with Data and Making Data, that I'd recommend checking out. Making with Data shows a lot of process of different artists working in this way. And I have work in both of them. So this is where I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. Being in a natural, beautiful place has really had a big impact on me and has inspired some of my work. I love the feeling of being immersed in snow. It makes me feel like a child. And I've always been a little frustrated with how data reduces the natural world into like the most boring form possible, which is just numbers in a table. And I use my work to kind of reconcile that. So when you grow up in a snowy place, especially with skiing as a big part of the culture, there's always this, well, 10 years ago, the season was so much better. And I was like, I want to look at the data and see what that long-term trend is. And luckily, we're at a time and place where you can download a lot of historic archives of data. So this is a resource of the snow water equivalent of 1 annual water year of snowfall at a particular site. And then this is 31 years of that data, which is as far back as that record goes at the time that I did this project. So you can see, this is in the Sierra Nevadas. There's quite a large variable in terms of year to year. It could be 5-fold different amount of water in the snowpack. So I take all of those and I sketch out how I might interpolate them together to show those long-term trends. And then, I work in a wood shop, so I have access to a lot of machinery and carefully construct a piece using, in this case, more traditional furniture techniques to build a cabinet. I don't often make purely functional work, but in this case, I wanted to draw a correlation between how snow is this amazing way nature stores water in the snowpack, and we store things in drawers. So these drawers are sized based on how much water there is in the snowpack. Some of them are tiny, and you can't actually put anything in them because we didn't have any water that year. So there's the full piece in kind of vertical orientation. Each one is a drawer. They're all different sizes. It's really hard to make, but in my mind, it was worth it to do all that extra work because I feel like the piece should be represented that way. All right, so form, the shape and structure of something as distinguished from its material. These are an example of a really wonderful river meander map. These maps are of the entire Mississippi River Valley from 1944. A cartographer named Harold Fisk created them, mostly from aerial photography. I took these maps, one example of those maps, to the Oregon Water Science Center in Portland during residency up there, and asked if they had anything similar I could use for a project because I wanted something more site-specific to where I was. They provided me this LiDAR map of the Molalla River showing 15 years of how the river has changed shape over time. Each color is, every 5 years. I then interpolate the in-between years to create a form that's buildable. So there's some interpretation there. In this case, I had these pieces cut out of plywood on a CNC router so that they could be very accurately cut and as true to the data as possible. And then I get into the process of carving. So these are some of the tools that I use. Various abrasive handheld tools, lots of safety equipment. It's really loud and dusty. It's also really enjoyable to work that way in some respects because it's just full body immersion instead of thinking all the time about what you're doing and if it's worth doing. So this is the final piece. You can see that there was a flood in this river in between, I believe, 2005 and 2009. So there's a new arm of the river that was formed. So let's talk about data. I actually am not that interested in data in and of itself. I mentioned it's just a raw, reduced, abstracted form of like the amazing world around us. And I feel that it's a great building block to inform my work, and I like looking at it as a resource, but I'm not really just trying to represent it as it is. I'm really interested in what happens when you present data and it takes a form, and then when that form is interpreted by a subjective human, because that last step is required for that raw data to become transformed into knowledge. And I'm more interested in knowledge than data in and of itself, which requires meaning, and meaning requires a subjective experience. So it's a building block that I also fold in history and other things to try and create a more meaningful experience for people. Why do we separate out logic, reason from emotion? It's basically because of Descartes, which during the Enlightenment, he believed that to obtain the best results, emotions must be kept out, rational processing must be unencumbered by passion, is basically what they used to call emotions. So the whole idea that we could separate our emotions and our logic, which is kind of what all of science is founded on, doesn't really work because we're still human. We're still very emotional creatures. Been recently really into this book called The Shape of Time. I just gave a whole talk in February in Ireland called The Shape of Time, sort of inspired by George Kugler. He believes that human sensibility is the only channel to the universe for us. Emotions function like a main valve in the circuit between us and the universe. So they're quite important and can really help science become meaningful to a general population. Emotions must be artificially regulated by chemistry and psychiatry, but neither of those sciences can engage the instruments of enlarge the instruments of aesthetic experience. Such enlargements always remain the prerogative of artistic invention. So when you look at nature, we actually have some really great examples of data collection being represented in physical materials all around us, such as with dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, ice cores, stratigraphy of rock layers. We can figure out so much information from just looking at these historic material records of change over time and long-term changes in the landscape. These are both related to the Colorado River, which I learned and inspired a piece that it no longer hits the ocean anymore. That made me really curious about what we use all that water for, and not just all of the water from the Colorado River, but from the entire United States. And luckily, there's a great USGS report about that. So this chart on the far side shows basically a bar graph of what we use categorically all of the water in the United States for. This yellow section, which is what, like 48%, goes just to power generation. And I thought that was kind of surprising. I would think we would be using water for more, I don't know, irrigation makes more sense to me. Domestic use makes more sense to me. So I wanted to turn that into a sculptural form that kind of references arid landscapes in relation to the lack of water. So this piece ended up becoming a canyon. The walls of the canyon are getting wider or narrower based on how much water we're using for each categorical use. So basically the bottom is 1950 and the top is 2000. So that's 50 years of water data in a piece. So the number one question I get about my work is how long did it take? And I think that's because that's how people relate to a piece. Like how long did it take you to make that is, I can imagine myself doing that if it took a week, if it took a year, whatever. Most of my pieces take around a year probably, but not like me continuously working 40 hours a week. It's a lot of startup projects, set it aside, do something else, have to travel, do a residency, come back, find the machine that can make it, do a little bit more work, that kind of thing. The second question I get most often about my work is, can I touch it? Which also shows a level of engagement. People want to have a sensory experience. I think it's a really great way to deeply connect emotionally to something. So I did a Fulbright fellowship in 2022 in Scotland and ended up doing a lot of research into material knowledge, and brings me to my second part of how information can be embedded in a physical object through the material itself. Physical materials have properties, and they also require different skills and techniques and machinery to be able to work with different materials, which I find endlessly fascinating. And they all bring like a very unspoken quality to a piece. Not only that, they have a really specific connection to a place. Like in this case, 3 different kinds of marble, depending on where that marble was formed, have very different qualities. Ewell marble is from Colorado, not too far from where I grew up. Connemara marble is green, and it's from Ireland. And then Carrara marble is the one you're probably more familiar with in Italy, kind of the more infamous marble. So each of those materials can be connected to a very specific experience of a cultural object in this case. The Lincoln Memorial was made out of Ewell marble. Joseph Walsh is a furniture maker out of Ireland who uses Connemara marble. And then the Michelangelo is made out of Carrara marble. So I've done a little bit of work with a lot of different materials. Most of what I've shown thus far has been woodworking, metalworking, more traditional furniture materials. I really wanted to break out of that at some point, and just not every piece, when your data in this case is about glaciers, should be made out of wood, because there's no real connection between the material and the idea. So the idea always takes precedent for me. This is myself in front of a glacier in Alaska. I did a residency up there, I forget what year, and started doing research on glaciers. Partnered with a scientist who provided some maps showing this particular glacier as it was retreating over time. And I turned that into a sculpture in which time becomes one of the dimensions. So the vertical, the z-axis, becomes the dimension of time, showing how that glacier has retreated. I then carved the positive out of plywood, because those are my familiar materials, and then went through a process of creating a negative mold from that plywood positive. So the pink stuff in my hand is a silicone casing that captures all of the texture, and then the white thing behind it is a two-part plaster mold in which I can then cast other materials into that negative shape. And in this case, I made an ice sculpture, which then is documented as it melts throughout a day. So this project started research-wise and design-wise while I was in Alaska, and then waited probably about a year until I got to a different residency where I was able to cast it and document it. While I was presenting some of that work in Alaska, a scientist came up to me at the end of my presentation and said, "You need to know about albedo." And so that kind of started me on a new project. So sometimes projects lead into the next one. You find new inspiration in the next thing. So albedo is a reflection coefficient. It is how white a surface is, and the whiteness determines how much energy will be reflected off of it. So a dark surface absorbs energy, white surface reflects it. It's really important in studying Arctic sea ice, because obviously if you have massive white chunks of ice, they're reflecting a lot of the energy from the sun. If those start to melt, as you can see in the sea ice loss inside over there in 2015, the ocean becomes a lot darker, it absorbs a lot more of the energy, it heats up faster, and it becomes a feedback loop. This is why that scientist told me I need to know about albedo. I was able to do a residency at a glass casting facility just in Oakland, right near where I live. And so they provided materials and facilities to be able to cast glass. I ended up taking photographs of that broad expanse of just sea ice going out into the distance and translate them into three-dimensional forms that could be cast. So a similar process as to with the glacier piece, make a positive. In this case, it's cut on a CNC, using the photographic imagery digitally to create a three-dimensional surface, mill it out, then create a negative shape that I can layer glass in, and then in the kiln, it gets all fused together and becomes a final glass cast. In this case, I was using different gradations of glass to sort of show the depth of blue and the darkness versus the lightness of the chunks of ice. So trying to take the concept of albedo and really translate it into this very different material, but having the final object still retain some of the properties of the bubbles in the water and the way that light hits it and refracts through the glass. So I've been able to make a couple of these in a larger scale. And some of the narrower ones I just dropped off last week at the University of Oregon in Eugene, where they have them in their collection now. I want to talk just very briefly about interdisciplinary collaboration, because it's a really awesome part of what I'm able to do through some of my projects. And I really love working not just with scientists, but with other artists when I can collaborate in some form or fashion. So this next project I'll show was quite complex, and I did it in a very short amount of time, but I had a show in Pittsburgh that was about climate change, and rather than just shipping all the work I had made in California, they were plopping it down and saying, "This is about climate change." I proposed to make new work somehow responding to Pittsburgh and its role throughout history as, kind of the epicenter of the oil, production in America, and did a bunch of research around freshwater mussels, because freshwater mussels are dying at a really quick rate, sort of a mass die-off. I was there for 3 weeks. The first week I spent partnering with people who are experts in freshwater mussels. So the USDA Forest Service took me out on the Allegheny River. We collected a bunch of shells. There was a really, really fun, quirky guy who runs the mollusk collection at the Carnegie Museum of History, who I connected with. And then Three Rivers Waterkeep was another company that took me out that monitors industrial waste coming into the river. So partnering both with the science side. In this case, I took 2 other craftspeople and also collaborated with them. So one is a basket weaver in Pittsburgh who grows his own willow. He has his own farm, and we ended up working together. He wove some forms, and then I had a friend from years back in Pittsburgh who's a glass blower, and we ended up blowing glass into the basket forms to try and kind of combine both of their craft expertise, but responding to Pittsburgh as a place and some of the craft in that site, as well as the final pieces, which were all inspired by the mussel shells. The third component of this is acid mine drainage. So I connected with the Office of Surface Mining, who gave me a site where I could get acid mine drainage, which is essentially iron oxide. So they gave me a bunch of this red sludge. I dried it all out. And it's actually embedded in the glass. So you can use it as a component in art. They use it to make paint. It's essentially a colorant. It's also used as a food dye in some foods. But it comes from old mines in Pittsburgh in this case. So they're embedded in some of these glass pieces. We ended up making a collection of objects that were all on view in the show. Super fun collaboration. And there I am with Dan and Julian, who both were my collaborators. And then you can kind of see the sculptural forms we made, the colors and the kind of textures were all really relating back to those mussel shells. Got a whole series on wildfires. I won't get too deep into it, but it's something we've all been dealing with in California a lot more recently. I originally started this project when I had, again, a personal influence. I was up near the Rim Fire in 2013, which was just outside Yosemite when that happened, and overnight the air was just awful. And that really made me start researching fires. And since then, our fire history has gotten intensely worse. That was in 2013. So most of the worst fires have happened within the last 5 to 10 years. I started this project by collecting charcoal from the fire itself. So I went through a process of making ink using the actual wood from the fires, and then did these very intricate kind of three-dimensional-esque drawings using the charcoal ink, which look like this, which is a CAD rendering, hand rendered with ink and charcoal, using materials directly from the fire. These are all based on the actual fire progression map. So I took each perimeter of where the fire was as it was growing over time and turned that into a drawing. I also did this project in a three-dimensional sculptural form. I have one example up here that y'all can look at in person after. But really just started making me think about, okay, why are fires getting so bad? What's going on here? When you start to look at it, the dialogue around fires is, yes, they're destructive, they're deadly, they cost a lot of money, but the flip side is that we're building houses in places that used to burn naturally and actually need to burn. Most fires are started by people, not by nature, so are they really natural disasters? And many of those places require fire to actually regenerate. So there's a part of that conversation that's not really quite happening. Like, you can't just say fires are good or bad. There's more things that need to be discussed in that. Furthermore, we've been managing forests pretty horribly over a long period of time. So you can see Yosemite Valley in 1899 was naturally barely cut back just because fires burned regularly. Once you stop fires, the growth builds up and it needs to burn at some point. So I did some sculptural works based on those wildfire progression maps. This one's of the Cedar Fire, which at the time was the largest wildfire in California history. It was in 2003 in San Diego. I did a residency in San Diego, so I wanted to do something kind of related to that site. And that has grown into a small series. So this is where we start to bring in space. There's a geographic space of the map of the fire, and then again, the z-axis becomes time. So for the cedar fire, I believe it's 114 hours of a fire burning, seeing where it's still burning at time. And then you start to talk about space-time and where they can collide. So this is sort of the edge of the next range of research I'm doing to incorporate into what it means to make time physical in an object in front of you. The process of making these wildfire pieces is extremely complicated, so I won't get too deep into it, but it does involve a plaster positive and then a wax negative that gets pulled off of that. And then from the wax, you can use that wax to create a cast bronze piece. I partner with a foundry to do that because it requires specialized equipment that I don't have. Here you can see the patina, which is a chemical process of blackening the bronze, because I wanted it to have like a really charred black look. I've been very influenced by a particular American philosopher named John Dewey. He has this wonderful book called Art as Experience, and in it he proposes something I feel is very important. He says that when we tend to think of art, we think of art as, when we think of art, we think of art objects. He believes that thinking of art as just an object is kind of a mistake, and that the art is actually the connection of two experiences. The first experience would be the act of doing or making, and then the second part would be the undergoing or perceiving. So the art isn't just an object, it's a connection between the person who made the work and the person who's perceiving the work, and allowing that connection to be made through an object. So we need to stop thinking about artworks as simply objects and start thinking about them as triggers for experience. I think this is the last piece I'm going to show, is kind of shows this circular experience, action experience. So an experience and environment is kind of like something that really spoke to me. You have a thought response to what you've experienced. You create an action that then alters that environment, and then that shapes the next experience, and the cycle kind of continues. That's how we end up with massive cities and kind of where we are now in the world. I mentioned I went to Scotland in 2022. I ended up doing a project there based on my experience of being in a new place, which is often where I find inspiration. Scotland has had a lot of more intense storms recently, particularly extratropical cyclones, because warm air comes up from the Caribbean. And what's been happening there are these really powerful storms, in some cases knocking down entire forests because the wind gusts become very intense, and it's something they haven't seen before. But the amount of force required to take a tree down like that is immense. I responded to this by partnering with scientists who study these extratropical cyclones. This is what they look like from space. And he ended up advising me kind of on how they form, and showed me this graphic, which is essentially about cyclogenesis, so showing a 4-stage process of how that spiral pattern happens. I ended up working with the botanical garden at the university I was doing the Fulbright at. Here I am using their clay studio to create kind of a concept model of an interpretation of that cyclogenesis graphic that I ended up turning into an earthwork at the botanical garden. So I partnered with them. They provided a site where a bunch of eucalyptus trees had been damaged and basically had to be taken down because of one of these storms. That area was kind of in disarray, and I proposed doing a public artwork there that was about the storms that took those down. So we actually ended up chopping up the trees, putting them inside the form, and then Trevor, who you can see here in the foreground, is the guy who runs their tractors, and he sort of like, based on a collaboration, built out this cyclogenesis form just from the materials that were at the site. It's still in progress. It is being planted. So the next stage is to select plants, which will propagate and then like take over. So it's going to be living beyond this initial form I've designed. There's a Google Earth view, kind of what they look like from space, and then that concept model I made in clay. I also created an installation of a lot of different objects, all kind of experiments into what I was researching into material knowledge while I was at the university there. So some of them you can see in the foreground, a lot of different materials, some found objects. This piece is a bronze casting that I created in their foundry. So as an example of one of the objects that's in there, this one's actually a carving I did based on the Coriolis effect, which you guys know has to do with the movement of air around the Earth based on how we are spinning. That was also loosely inspired by these really mysterious, cool stone balls that have been found all over Scotland that are larger. They're about this big. They're as old as 5,200 years, and they have these really beautiful carvings in them. So kind of responding to an archaeological object of mystery. Nobody really knows what they were used for. And then creating kind of my own version based on the Coriolis effect. Some of the included materials in that installation were remnants of the process of casting the bronze, which is very complicated. I won't get too deep into, but here you can see the bronze balls being broken out of a ceramic shell. So those ceramic shell pieces were included in the installation. And then here I am installing all of those objects. It was in what's called the Living Lab, another building they have kind of used for educational events on the Botanical Garden grounds, so people could see the earthwork. I used earth from the earthwork to do the installation. And then that's a screen kind of photo of some of the objects I created along those lines. Currently, this is the piece that's on my workbench in the wood shop. It's kind of an interpretation of the shape of the Monterey Bay Canyon out of carved plywood. And then I have a small maquette here that I have of the same piece, but kind of in the opposite form, where I was creating a wax from it to potentially cast in bronze. So you all are welcome to come down and actually physically experience some of the work, should you so desire. You can touch it. It's always a fun one. So thank you.
We got time for questions so much. I'm going to start with giving folks that are in here an opportunity to ask questions, and then I'll go to questions on Zoom. So, and throw the mic down. Does anyone here have a question they want to ask?
You hear me? I haven't done art before, but use the word like residency a lot. So I was just wondering like what a residency for art looks like and like what entails that.
It's a really good question. Yeah, it's there's a lot of different types of residencies typically. An artist residency is something that you would apply for. And it would be usually through an organization, either an arts organization or a university, or some kind of like space you could go to and spend a set amount of time working either in a new setting or with different kinds of machinery or equipment that you might not normally have access to. Some of them you're totally alone and you're the only person there, so it's like quiet time to reflect and like come up with new ideas or do whatever you need to do your art practice. Sometimes it's with like a group of other artists that all like are working on their own projects, but then you have a community of people that you're all kind of bouncing ideas off of or seeing how they work or like just generally, you know, like sharing that time and space. So there's a big range of them. Sometimes there will be like a show or a presentation at the end. Sometimes there's a community component where you might do like a workshop kind of thing. So there's a lot of different kinds, but generally they're promoted as like time and space to get out of your daily grind to have some fresh, space in your mind to come up with either new ideas or finish a project or like kind of just keep your practice going forward. Kind of answer your question. Yeah. Do they have anything like that for scientists? I guess this space is kind of like that, right? You guys are all out of your daily thing. You all get to hang out with each other, share meals, that kind of thing. Yeah.
What?
I was wondering if so back talk about collaborating with scientists and asking more about different ways of knowledge, right? Because talk about data as kind of raw thing that the right a room full of scientists, and like I'm guessing for them their data sets really emotion rich, like there's a lot of feeling and a lot of care and a lot of labor at the end of it. Those things are there, but they're put very different ends. And if you're working with scientists, I guess how would you talk about like what is your goal and how does that different and how does that build off it? It's a very big unwieldy question. I apologize, but just like collaborations are very close, similar, but they're towards very different ends. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like what's your end goal? Like what?
Yeah. Oh, I like the other part of your question. I don't like the end goal question because I feel like when you're doing a scientific experiment, it's usually like you're proposing what you think is going to happen, and then you're proving whether or not it does happen that way. So it's a really specific end goal. Whereas like the slide I had where it says art is about asking questions, not answering them, it's more just about like opening up a space to change your perception and think about things in a different way. And that means that if, as an artist, I have an end goal of making you think a particular way, then I'm creating propaganda more than I'm creating artwork, if that's kind of a strong statement, but that's sort of what I mean. Like, so my goal isn't to like make you think a certain thing. It's more to just explore different ways of experiencing the world and to share that with people so that they can have their own experience with the work that I make. And I'm not trying to control what their experience is. But to get back to like the collaboration with scientists, I want to differentiate that, yes, absolutely, we're all human, so we all have like a lot of emotion. And some of the best ways I found to connect with scientists when starting a collaboration is to just ask them what it was that caused them to want to like have that passion to study whatever it is that they're studying. Because there's usually a really beautiful, interesting story behind that. Like when I was 5, I was on a boat and I fell in the water and like someone saved me, and then I knew I wanted to be a marine biologist or whatever. Like there's usually something really human behind that. And I feel like it is the field of science and the way that science operates with peer-reviewed, journals where it must be rigorous to this degree, and if you have any emotional response to what you're studying, you have to keep that out of your research findings because it shows that you somehow aren't doing due diligence to keep it like pure. That's the part where I feel like science is really necessary to not have an emotional influence to be practiced to that rigor. But we all need to acknowledge that we are human and we are going to have responses to what we're studying, particularly in the time of like climate change and what's happening in the natural world and how there's a lot of emotion behind that. And it's something we all need to be able to talk about. So I think that's where art can kind of become a thing that can be coupled with science as a way to like, okay, well, this is the scientific research, this is what the findings are, how do we talk about what that means? Like art can pick up that conversation and take it to the next level. And it's not about like, well, you do your stuff and I do my stuff. Like there's a lot of overlap in how those collaborations can happen. So I've worked with a number of scientists who are just like, we're the exact same. We're both experimenting in similar ways and trying to figure out how things work. We're working with materials, we're working in a lab or a studio. Like there's a lot of common parallels. It's just that the final product, if you want to call it that, is it serves a very different purpose. But throughout history, art and science didn't used to be divided. When it was natural philosophy, like that was all in the same practice. So it's always worth mentioning that science, art, all of these divisions between fields are very culturally, those are all like cultural factors that change over time. It's not like there's not like an overarching, like this is how things are. That kind of makes sense. I'm kind of butchering the end of this question, but like those divisions are made up. Part of them is from school, you know, so I find the most rewarding part of my personal practice is that I get to engage with people from all different fields. And I'm not an expert in any one thing, but I get to pull from other people's knowledge and kind of tie it all together into a project that layers those things together. And it's not so siphoned off into one corner that only speaks the language of certain terminology in a really specific field that nobody else can understand. I'm trying to make it more accessible to everyone by bringing it up to like a general understanding and a more intuitive understanding through the experience of the artwork. I would say art has a lot of problems in its own respect in terms of how we talk about it and how elitist it can be and how, you know, it costs a lot of money to go to a museum. So is it really accessible? Like there's a lot of issues on that side of things, but we all just need to find common ground between that. And I found that working with scientists is a really fun endeavor when they're open to working with an artist. Yeah. It's not always true, but some of them do.
Hi, I was wondering, like, keep your art like statistically accurate so that it could be like scientifically interpreted too.
That's a great question. I try to keep like the shapes and lines that I'm pulling from like maps or, you know, charts determined on numerical proportions like as accurate as possible. But obviously, like as soon as you get into the real world, things get really messy. So if I'm carving with my hands, like there's not going to be a like way to absolutely perfectly match like a shape to a number to a thing. So luckily, nobody's studying my work to try and interpolate the scientific principles behind it, because that's not really the purpose it serves. It's more of like a bridge to connect what that research is and see it in a bigger context, as opposed to like, if you measure 3 inches over and 6 inches down, it should be this tall to give you this measurement because it was at that time of that day. Like it's not being used that way. It's more about like the longer term trends or the overall like shapes and the relationships and patterns and changes over time. So it's more of like a general, it's not quite as specific as what I think you're asking about in terms of like if it can be measured more specifically from the physical object to the data source it came from. So I take, you know, a bit of artistic license in my interpretation of the science behind it, but it's also because my purpose isn't to create scientific objects. Yeah, I create artistic objects that are based on science. And obviously not all of them are based on data. You know, like some of them are a bit more expansive, such as like the Freshwater Mussels project. It's more inspired by that gives an object that can start a conversation around what's happening. And then people who are on the more scientific end of the spectrum can then use that as a bridge to do the research into how many mussels are actually disappearing and what's the source of that disappearance. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your work. It was really cool to see sort of your journey and thinking about this and visualizing data. I really appreciated the time component of all of your pieces. I think that that's just a really cool thing to think about, especially like in visual form. And, you know, you're making these different pieces in a time of like incredibly rapid environmental change, which, you know, I think is maybe something you're trying to speak to through your art. But I was wondering, as scientists, we think a lot about like baseline data and having sort of, these data sets that exist prior to these rapid changes. And so I was wondering if you've ever thought about like potentially like revisiting some of your like earlier work and maybe like doing the same form or like doing it again and just seeing like how different it looks. Like I was thinking in particular the water usage one. So I'm sure our water usage has changed dramatically since 2000. And so like what would that piece look like if you made it today, or if you use even data that's projecting that use into the future? Like, do you think that would be like something cool to do?
Yeah, I've actually contended a bit with that. So the particular report that canyon-shaped one on water consumption statistics is based on, they re-release that report every 15 years. So they did a release in 2015, and it actually showed there was a pretty big reduction in water usage, which was like normally we're used to all the news sort of being negative, and I was really delighted when I looked that back up because it was being shown in a new show, and I was like, oh, I should update the data. And yeah, it's gone down. So there is definitely, it's worth revisiting some of them. What I find fascinating, and it's something I really started butting my head against after like looking up different data sources, is that a lot of environmental data gets really spotty before satellites, so if you go back, I guess satellites went up in like the 70s is kind of the earliest scientific data we were collecting like on that scale. So everything before that is either observation or written accounts, and it gets a lot harder to interpret that because it's not regular and maybe the units were different, and like our actual data record gets very confusing. Yet to actually study climate change, you need more than 30 years of data to have like a more accurate picture or see a big change. So it's interesting that we're sort of at the precipice of being able to actually see how big the changes that are happening simply because the length of data required now exists. I have made various versions of some pieces. So I've made 2 versions of the snow cabinet using different sites. And I've made 3 versions of the tidal datum piece, one from New Orleans, which has a very different pattern, and the one was site-specific in Alaska, where it's installed in the harbor building of Homer, Alaska. So they have a really big tidal range of like 26 feet, so it was a really cool site to be able to pull data from. I love being able to see the format change based on the data that's determining the piece. But for some pieces, like adding 1 more year wouldn't change the pattern so much. And what I've pushed up against in terms, I just look for the longest possible data sets that exist. So there's one data set for the Nile River that goes back around 500 or 600 years from the millimeter that they had tracking the river levels over time. Unfortunately, that data didn't look so interesting overall, but there are various specific sources you can find that go way back in time, but it is harder. What you start to look at is then more of a cultural folk language across generations. I think the oldest civilization, the Aboriginal civilization in Australia, have continuously occupied the same landscape for 50 to 60,000 years. And they have a really different conception of time, which I think is insanely fascinating and is part of the research I've been doing this year around time and how it's represented. So I think that culturally, now scientists are starting to look a lot more at incorporating indigenous knowledge around landscapes, because we've only been here in America for 250-ish years, but there were a lot of civilizations that were here way, way longer. And their knowledge about changes in the landscape might not fit perfectly into a scientific, rigor of what that needs to be to be understood, but it's still really valuable knowledge. So that's kind of where my next range is going into. it's sort of beyond traditional data. Yeah.
We got time for one last question, and when we're done, folks want to check out some of the art pieces for a little bit. Maybe we'll still bring them to the South
Yeah,
Lounge
sure,
for our
totally.
So any more questions, we can do it over at the Wednesday Wine Jam, South Lounge.
As an artist and scientist, it's really cool to see your presentation. I do have a question, so you can just choose which one you like. How do you explain like the ideas or the science behind the art when you have just the piece itself? And my second question is, how do you get your art in the world? I know you've done shows, I see it there, but if you have any other, like,
Yeah, those are both really good questions. I think like getting your art into the world, it's different for every artist. Every artist kind of has their own path, and unfortunately, it's not one of those things where like it's easily laid out. Like first you get your internship, and then you do your thing, and then you get a job. Like I work for myself, and I've worked for myself this whole time. I teach sometimes. Like we all got to make a living, but like there's some artists who have a gallery who represent them that then can promote and sell their work to collectors that would be amenable to that work, and that's how they make it work. There are some that just do public art, and that's all their focus is. And then there's some that like make really cool Instagram accounts and can sell a ton of work that way if you're really good at making it look cool. I'm kind of none of those, so I just kind of like jump from project to project, and it sort of takes its own natural progression. And then residencies have really helped because they kind of like push you to work in new ways and expand into new projects. So all of those things are really important. But as like to be an artist, you just kind of have to find your own path to what works for you. And sometimes it's not even like your choice because it's who like responds most to your work. And we can all, you know, like the whole starving artist narrative. There's so many artists who were never recognized at all during their entire lifetime, only are recognized posthumously. So it's one of those fields where like if you're trying to be an artist to get famous, it's really a poor choice because your chances are so low. It might happen after you die, and that's not really the kind of gratification you're looking for. So you just have to do it because you love it. Like I knew early on that I couldn't have a normal job or do anything where I was doing the same thing every day or working in an office. And I love working in a wood shop just because it's a bunch of people who also work for themselves, and it's kind of like a lab where there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. And then I get to set my own schedule, so all of that works really well. But each person kind of got to choose their own path and do what fits best with the things that they're inspired to make. And I think the key there is to just make sure you're always making what inspires you and not just doing something because you think it'll sell better or like get more attention. Because if you don't like follow your inspiration, you're going to end up somewhere you don't necessarily like. I guess that would be my advice there. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Let's thank Adrian one more time.
Thank you.
Come join us in the South Lounge. Have some drinks, check out the art. Book is supposed to go. One person to another. I think I've seen